Welcome to SUAANGAN. I'm Debbie Gordon-Rubin. Tonight we will bring you the conclusion of the panel discussion with the Beaufort Delta self-government negotiators. They will explain where they are at today with the negotiations. We're back again with Vince Teddy, Bob Simpson, John Bailey, and
Fred Talon,
sorry.
It's okay.
I'd like to ask Vince and Bob how the negotiations are going between the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in and bringing the two together to build the Beaufort Delta self-government structure.
Well, maybe if I can respond first. We've settled that years back. We've decided as both Inuvialuit and Gwich'in to work together towards a one self-government agreement for the Beaufort Delta. Mm-hmm. And both the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation and the Gwich'in Tribal Council have agreed to that, and we've sent in our contribution agreement and our proposal, I should say, years back, and that working relationship still continues today. There is a wish of the community leaderships to, have more meetings between the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation and the Gwich'in Tribal Council to solidify and build up that relationship, and that's something that hopefully will happen in the near future, where there's going to be more meetings of both parties on a regular basis. But that's something that both parties do continue to work together on this, and it's been working good to this point in time, and it looks like it's going to work into the near future for both parties. And this week we continue, or I should say this month we also continue as the three parties, not only the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in, but the federal government and the territorial government. And that's something that maybe Bob and John and Fred can get into detail as to what we've accomplished so far at this session.
Mm-hmm.
What we're really trying to do is redefine kind of working relationships within some government structures, and between the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit, when I told you about all the work that we did in workshops and the communities identifying their issues, and the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in doing that as well, their instructions to me are very similar. There's very little differences between Inuvialuit and Gwich'in, what type of things that they're looking for in self-government at a leadership level. So I take a lot of confidence from when they approve my mandate that they're giving me one set of instructions rather than a lot of different things that may be opposing to each other. So we went about confirming that, because it's been several years since the leadership had told us go to the negotiations and here's what you're to go get, and we made sure that we did a lot of community work and find out what people's issues are, etc. And in the same context, we're doing that with non-Aboriginal people in a way within the municipality here, or even in the other communities. We'd like to try and take a very much of a inclusive approach to our work and to our negotiations, and really spending a lot of time discussing this week during the negotiations what our relationship should be with the territorial and federal government on an ongoing basis as well, because we're part of Canada, we're part of the Northwest Territories, and we have to really begin to redefine things and work out some new relationship that's going to work, rather than continuing working on the basis of conflicts and criticizing the federal or territorial government for the things that have gone on in the past. We'd like to sort of say, okay, well, let's put that aside and let's work towards the future.
Mm-hmm. This week in your meetings here, your negotiations, maybe you can touch on a little bit of what what the territorial government is bringing to this session of the talks with self-government, and then we'll go with the other stuff.
This week we started with Child and Family Services and adoption, looking at how we're going to deal with that, and we made a lot of progress this week on that subject, and as well health services, how healthcare and health programs are going to be delivered in the Beaufort Delta region. We've been discussing that earlier this week as well, and I think we made some good progress on that subject.
And what have been the federal government's input to this week's talks with all of the negotiators here?
Well, Debbie, some of the subjects are more territorial and federal, some of the others are more federal and territorial. Let's take, for example, the one that Fred started with, which is Child and Family Services and Adoption. Well, there are aspects of that we're talking about as perhaps being properly the jurisdiction of Aboriginal governments. Custom adoption, for example. There are aspects of that might be shared as public government responsibility in the Beaufort Delta, say by the Beaufort Delta regional government, when there is one, and the territorial government. And backstopping that, all of us say, whoever will hold the responsibility, the primary concern is the best interests of children, which is agreed around the table. So how do we make sure that the jurisdiction and authority, the responsibility, rests in the most appropriate hands in terms of which government, and at the same time make sure that the best interests of children are looked after. Children move around with their parents, whether in the territories or within Canada or outside Canada. So you can see that there may be roles for all three governments, either the ones that are already at the table or those that will be created. They have an interest. The retrieval of children who may be abducted may well be something that the federal government has a special responsibility in to deal with other countries. The territorial government may have an interest to make sure that there's a common standard of what we consider to be, say, the standards for children in need of protection. If somebody has to go in and help those children or take them out of their homes temporarily or long term and so forth. And yet these children are the children of people in the Beaufort Delta, so they also have a crucial responsibility and a great interest that in the welfare of those children. And so there's a balancing in a subject like that, and we discuss where the responsibility should properly lie, both to take into account the interests of the children and the interests of the parties represented at the table.
We also need to, as well as it's not just dealing with governments, it's, especially when you're dealing with children, the raising of children, the role of the family, the role of the community, which is perhaps a little bit different than in other regions or south of 60. Certainly in the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in communities, the community does have a role in the protection of children and ensuring that the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in children are raised in the way that they raise children, rather than the way that somebody else was raising children. So that's what we're trying to add, is in that element and that capability to allow it, rather than having a system of government which would impose this is the way that your children will be taken care of, or this is the way that families should be run. I mean, that's something that's is more culturally based.
Is that something that would be also further developed once you go to the elders, you get information back from the elders, and then you take the information and develop the hierarchy, as you call it, like say in the single communities? Would that be something that?
Definitely, Debbie. Once the traditional governance fieldwork is completed, all that information will be very integral to building the new structures of government within the Beaufort Delta. As Bob pointed out earlier, each of the communities will have constitutions that will guide them as how the affairs of government will be run and managed within those communities. So this traditional governance gathering of information and the traditional governance in the past will have a lot of impact on how we build these new constitutions that will guide the communities in governing themselves. So all of that will very well have a major impact and in the way these constitutions are developed. Fred talked about the health sub-agreement earlier, that we went a long ways in that, and that's something that up to this point in time right now, jurisdiction for Aboriginal standalone governments, we've so far what we've agreed to that is Aboriginal healers for one, and the non-insured health benefits is another. The rest of the jurisdiction will lie within the public system that's at the regional level, and that's something that we are satisfied with to this point in time, but both territorial and federal government knows that this is very new. These negotiations of the Aboriginal inherent right within a public system is very new, experimental, and we've agreed to try this out because we want to work together. Mm-hmm. We want to cooperate and have a good government systems, not only at the community level, but also at the Beaufort Delta level, regional level, and at the territorial level. And we want to build something that's sound, that's good, and we know that it's experimental, and we know that if it doesn't work, we want to have also within the agreement that let's try something else, and that's where a review and amendment chapter within the self-government agreement comes in very important, and that's something that both governments know is, if this doesn't work, we have the option of trying something else, and that's something that gives us a great deal of comfort as far as Inuvialuit and Gwich'in are concerned, because that gives us the ability then to say, let's try it within a more of a traditional sense, as a traditional government. So.
It should be said too that this research up project that we're doing with the field workers is hopefully documenting the Gwich'in way and the Inuvialuit way of doing things in the governance sense, but in a sense of the way they operated their families, their communities, and so forth, their way of life. So we're just starting that work, but we're hoping that it will continue, that the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in will continue to build on the information that we have, and whatever government that we do form, and it's a form of public government, or it's a Gwich'in or Inuvialuit government, they can use this information and start adopting and practicing not so much the old ways, but a way of doing things that is more conducive to their cultures and their way of life.
Is there a kind of a name that you're, when you go into negotiations, this certain name is for the government structure is set for the communities that are basically Gwich'in, basically Inuvialuit, as opposed to Inuvik, where it's a mixture of all of these different people, and the name you put to under like say Inuvik's structure.
Inuvik's probably a good example. We're coming up with one model, and right now we're trying to put tags on different names of governments, but we're calling it a United Community Government. Mm-hmm. And it will have a form of guaranteed representation. Some people may say that we're dividing the community. Well, right now we do have 3 governments in Inuvik. What we're trying to do is create a form of government in which the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in and the public form of government can work together under one roof. So that, to us as negotiators, is uniting these government institutions. Mm-hmm. That's one example.
Yeah, our names for these are sometimes confusing. We actually give them tags. We have one called the Polituck Model. It has nothing to do with what's going on in Polituck. It just happens that when we were in Polituck, we thought about this one. So, but it's essentially one in which there would be a local government, a community government, designed by the beneficiaries. In Polituck, it would be the Inuvialuit, mm-hmm. but it would be inclusive. And so for that small number of people who are not Inuvialuit in Polituck, they would be included. They would be able to vote, to nominate people for office, and even to run for office, and they just have to meet whatever the eligibility requirements were to participate in the public government. But it would function by bringing people into a single chamber kind of government, much like the existing municipal governments do, except that this one would not be designed constitutionally by the territorial government through its legislation. It would have to meet certain basic criteria, but the model, the form of it, would be created within the community, in this case by the Aboriginal people of that community. And that's what Bob was talking about when he talked about constitution building, being very much what we see as a community responsibility, and where the community is predominantly Aboriginal, the responsibility of the Aboriginal people.
And once the structure is in place for each of the communities, again, the community, residents of the community would vote for somebody to sit on a board to represent in the Beaufort Delta, and then from the Beaufort Delta, how would that work? They would to represent the whole of the territory.
Well, the way we're talking about it now, and you have to realize that we're in the midst of this. We haven't settled anything, but we enjoy the same ideas, share the same ideas, and that is that the local government, the community government, would have a chief counselor. And that person would be elected by everybody in the community who is eligible to vote and run for office, whatever model was appropriate for that community. And that person would be one of the regional councillors on a regional public government, which would represent everybody in the region, and would also have a chief councillor who would be elected by everybody eligible to vote within the region. To complicate things, or let me say to include the special interests of the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit, we are talking about there being regional Gwich'in and regional Inuvialuit governments, and they would also have representatives sitting on that regional council. So that, again, this is Bob's illustration, bringing things under one roof. So you don't have a government out there doing something in isolation from another. We're dealing with small communities where everybody knows one another and everybody shares the same problems. So having an agreed upon solution by all of the important players seems to us to be it's a shared objective.
So the people that are represented from this area, and then they'll also have an MLA for this area. Will they be working together with the MLA under the Legislative Assembly, or how does that work?
Well, the people in the Beaufort Delta would continue to elect MLAs to the Legislative Assembly, and the territorial government, which is the Legislative Assembly, would work with both the federal and the regional and government in the Beaufort Delta, as well as the community and Aboriginal governments. Some of those relationships are the subjects of our negotiations, and what we're dealing with right now is sorting out what those relationships are going to be in the future.
And how they will sit in would they call it like a Legislative Assembly, or have a different name when they all go to meet? The different regions all go to meet, say in Yellowknife, for instance, to discuss issues from their region. Say they want to bring it to the federal level, or how would that work?
There was there still is a constitutional working group that was trying to think about what type of territorial government should be created for the future, and it was trying to take into account some of those linkages with the regions and how to involve Aboriginal people quite a bit more in the workings of the Legislative Assembly in the future. We're right at the present, they're unable to achieve a solid consensus of what type of system they would like to create. But what we're hoping is, yes, MLAs will have a continuing role in directing the territorial government. And just as MLAs work with municipal councils or band councils or community corporations and taking into account their interests and issues that they bring up at the Legislative Assembly, they'll probably work a lot more closely with a regional council here and even participate in some of the discussions and hopefully take those to the Legislative Assembly and debate and hopefully try and achieve some of the things that the Beaufort Delta would like to have taken care of at a territorial level. And of course, territorial government will be working with the federal government on a national scene as well. So yes, I'm assuming that there's going to continue to be a lot of linkages and dialogue between the various levels of government after we have a self-government agreement, and probably stronger ones.
We just don't know how that's going to play out, because the two processes, although they involve some of the same people, Vince and Bob have both been part of that territorial discussion process. They are separate processes, and of course, Beaufort Delta is significantly ahead of some of the other regions in terms of developing its local government, its regional approach, and its Aboriginal self-government. There's some regions within the Western Northwest Territories that haven't actually got very far into that yet.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add, like as from your different areas that you would like the people of the Beaufort Delta to be informed about, from like as the Inuvialuit negotiator, as the chief negotiator for the Beaufort Delta?
Well, the only thing I could add right up to now is that our field workers are in the communities. When they do knock at your door, you know what they're there for. They're there to gather information on traditional governance. They want to build up the information in order for us to have that, as Bob said, within our own Beaufort Delta office, in order for us to build good constitutions for the communities. The leadership will, in the end, receive all of this information also in the Beaufort Delta region, and all that compiled together hopefully will build good constitutions, not only at the community level, but in the end at the regional level also. And our phone number's there for everyone. Everyone knows that Bob is always at the office. I'm easy to reach either in Tuck or Inuvik, so give us a call if you have any concerns or want to voice your opinions on it. We're available.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind saying some things that we did hear from residents within the region too, is that a lot of people are scared of self-government and in light of, oh, it's going to happen kind of tomorrow. Where we've been spending a lot of time discussing it now, we're actually having implementation type discussions before we even have an agreement in principle, which is very unusual. But we feel that strongly as chief negotiators that we better have some of those discussions now, so that we have an idea what type of new relationships we'll have with the other governments. And we're looking at the communities taking on authorities over a period of time, and we hopefully work with the communities and try and figure out with the communities what type of authorities they'd like to take on and what time span. The idea is that there'll be a lot more control, go at your own pace, and hopefully create more independent kind of communities to make their own decisions, and a great deal of self-sufficiency, hopefully, in the long term. So we're not talking about a project here that will just kickstart and have to be started tomorrow. We're talking very long term, between 10 and 20 years before people feel that they've really started to fully implement a self-government agreement. So it's a tool for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could just take up that one point of Bob's. One of the reasons I said we find it particularly valuable to go into communities is we get a sense that the capacity of the different communities to take on these things which we're saying they should be able to do and the agreement should permit them to do is different. Mm-hmm. And so if you take a community like Sax Harbor with whatever it is, 125 to 150 people, more than half of whom are young people, that's a very small community. And we're trying to do this in a way so that Sax Harbor could say, no, we recognize we have that responsibility, but we're not ready for it. And so we want to leave that where it is, or we want to lend it to the regional authority until such time as we're ready. And we recognize as well at the table that one of the things that has to happen is a capacity building project has to take place to help these communities so they'll be ready to take on some of these things. As Bob says, not necessarily immediately, but within a reasonable time. Otherwise, they'll say, what's the point? The only other thing I'd want to say is that one of the reasons we go into the communities is we hope that people will come out and help us. Tell us, for example, if they think we're off on the wrong track. Encourage us if they think we're on the right track. Ask us questions if what we're doing only makes sense to us and doesn't make sense to them. And we recognize the need to communicate more actively with people as we get closer to this, and as we're able to explain the shape a bit better, which we are now, much better than we were perhaps a year ago.
I think, personally, I think this is a very exciting time for the people in the Beaufort Delta region. I think this is a very unique opportunity that the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit people have, as well as all residents in the Beaufort Delta, to try and shape government in this area to make it better suit their needs and address their needs and work for them.
Thank you very much for coming in today. Throughout this broadcast season, we will continue to bring you programs on the Beaufort Delta self-government negotiations, where they are at, and where we will be going in the future.
Bernie!